In the quiet lowlands of northern Germany, the remains of a 9th century monastery stand open to the wind. Stones worn smooth by centuries form the outline of a place once filled with prayer, song, and the slow passing of seasons. Today, there are no monks, no services, no lit candles. Yet, at certain hours, a low, steady tone moves through the air inside these walls. It comes without warning, without visible cause, and fades as suddenly as it begins. For more than 100 years, the sound has been reported by travelers, recorded by researchers, and still its source remains unknown. Was it a quirk of stone and weather, a trace of ancient rituals, or something less easily explained? Join us as we follow the records, the measurements, and the quiet witnesses to a place where the air itself seems to remember. Chapter 1: The Monastery in the Valley of Fog. In the north of what is now Lower Saxony, there is a valley where the fog lingers longer than it should. Even in late summer, when the surrounding fields are clear by sunrise, the mist in this basin often remains until midday. Old survey records call the place Hugelmoor, the hill marsh, though the marsh itself drained centuries ago. Near its center stand the ruins of a 9th century Benedictine monastery. Built of thick sandstone, its cloister arches still intact but roofless, the chapel walls blackened by age. Local records place its founding between 822 and 826 CE, commissioned under the oversight of the Abbey of Corvey. The monks were few, perhaps no more than 12, tasked with tending a small scriptorium and maintaining a way station for travelers moving between the Weser River and the trading post at Bardowick. By the early 10th century, the monastery's presence was barely noted in regional chronicles, its output limited to minor religious copies and seasonal tithe accounts. The site's peculiar reputation emerged much later. Beginning in the mid-14th century, scattered references appear in church visitations and parish letters describing cantus sine fratribus, singing without brothers. The accounts are spare, often no more than a sentence, but they speak of plainsong heard in the chapel when it was empty. One of the earliest comes from a 1356 visitation report by a canon from Verden who noted, "In the hours before dawn, voices as in matins may be heard from the choir. Though no brethren be present, no further explanation was offered." Later mentions in the 15th and 16th centuries described the phenomenon with slightly more detail, remarking on the sound as low, steady, without variation, as though sung from far within the walls. In 1702, a Lutheran minister named Johann Albrecht Miner visited the site, by then already in ruin after the 30 Years' War. He recorded that on certain mornings the air inside the chapel seemed to carry a harmonic vibration, as if the stones themselves remembered the chant. He noted that the effect ceased when more than one person was present, and returned only when the listener was alone. Archaeological interest in the monastery began in the late 19th century, when the Prussian Heritage Office surveyed monastic ruins across the region. At Hugelmoor, they documented an unusual construction detail. The chapel's choir walls contained paired vertical shafts, each less than 10 centimeters in diameter, running from the floor level to the upper wall plate. Their purpose was unclear. Some suggested they were part of an early heating or ventilation system. Others thought they might have been acoustic in nature, amplifying or resonating with sung tones. When the site was partially excavated in 1964, researchers from Göttingen University found no crypt beneath the chapel, but they did uncover a layer of fine-grained river sand beneath the flagstones, unusual for inland construction of the period. The sand was clean, without debris, and appeared to have been deliberately packed to a uniform depth of about 15 centimeters. This layer would have altered the acoustic properties of the floor, absorbing some frequencies while reflecting others. In the same investigation, fragments of wooden choir stalls were recovered, preserved in anaerobic pockets of soil. Analysis suggested oak felled around 820 CE, worked with tools consistent with early Carolingian craftsmanship. No evidence of later modification was found, meaning the layout had remained stable until abandonment. Reports of the singing persisted into the modern era, though infrequently. In 1987, an amateur historian from Bremen recorded audio at the site over a series of mornings. On 2 separate days, his tapes captured faint harmonic tones between 60 and 120 Hz, audible when the wind was still. The origin of the tones was never identified. Wind through apertures can create similar sounds, but the frequencies recorded did not match the expected pattern for the monastery's architecture. Locals offer little speculation now. The valley is sparsely populated, and the ruins see few visitors outside of the occasional walking tour. Still, the regional archives hold a consistent chain of references spanning nearly 7 centuries, each noting sound where none should be. The structure is silent under most conditions, but sometimes, in the fog before the sun reaches the valley floor, there is the impression of a low, unbroken chant, too constant to be chants. Chapter 2: Foundations in Stone and Silence. The foundation of the Hugelmoor Monastery was set on a slight rise at the edge of the valley. From that position, a traveler approaching from the west could see the roofline long before reaching the marsh edge. Medieval cartularies note the land was granted by Count Wichman of the Billung family in 821 CE, with a formal consecration recorded 3 years later by Bishop Drasko of Verden. The charter survives in partial form, copied into the Corvey archives, its margins filled with later annotations in 12th century script. The ground beneath the monastery was not bare earth. A thin deposit of gravel and river-washed cobbles lay under the topsoil, suggesting that in earlier centuries the site may have been a seasonal flood terrace. Soil samples taken during the 1964 excavations showed alternating layers of silt and sand beneath the foundation trench, each representing a separate flood event. That detail may explain why the builders raised the floors on shallow plinths and packed the choir floor with clean sand. The stone used for the outer walls was a coarse-grained sandstone quarried from outcrops 14 kilometers north, near present-day Heiligen Moor. Tool marks on the surviving blocks show a consistent use of broad chisels and picks, with no variation in cut depth, indicating a small, skilled crew. The mortar binding the blocks was composed of lime mixed with crushed shell, a material not locally available but shipped from the Elbe estuary, over 80 kilometers away. Such choices imply either a specific directive from the abbey at Corvey or the import of craftsmen accustomed to certain methods. The ground plan followed a simple Benedictine layout: a rectangular nave, a smaller chancel to the east, and a cloister to the south with covered walkways. The cloister garth was never paved, and post-hole traces suggest it may have been planted with herbs or small trees. Archaeobotanical analysis from soil cores taken in the early 2000s identified pollen from lavender, sage, and tansy plants, commonly cultivated in monastic gardens for both medicinal and culinary purposes. No surviving chronicle mentions a large scriptorium, and the recovered manuscript fragments from the site are few, mostly psalters and homilies written in Carolingian minuscule. The absence of secular documents suggests the community focused on liturgical duties rather than scholarly output. Even so, the precision in the building's acoustic features stands out. The paired shafts in the choir walls, discovered in the 19th century, align not only vertically but also in spacing with the outer buttresses, creating alternating resonant and dampened zones along the interior. A survey carried out in 1978 by acoustician Klaus Redeker found that a plain chant sung at the intersection of the choir and nave produced a sustained reverberation of nearly 3 seconds, unusually long for a structure of its size. This would have given monastic chant a fullness well beyond what the small number of resident monks could produce unaided. To the north of the main complex, a detached bell tower once stood, its foundations marked by a square of dressed stone. An inventory list from 1289 notes a single bronze bell weighing 70 pounds, cast in the nearby town of Diepholz. The bell did not survive. It was likely melted down during the 16th century secularization. The tower's position, slightly offset from the church, would have allowed the bell's sound to travel down the valley without obstruction. In the surrounding fields, traces of ridge and furrow agriculture are still visible under certain light conditions. These patterns indicate that the monks oversaw small-scale farming, supplemented by fishing rights in the nearby Aller River. Tax rolls from 912 list modest grain tithes from tenant farmers, enough to sustain the community but not to generate wealth. What remains unclear is whether the acoustic qualities that later gave rise to the singing reports were intentional or incidental. The sand-packed floors, the wall shafts, and the proportional spacing of the choir all suggest deliberate attention to sound. Yet no contemporary document links these features to liturgical purpose. The absence of explicit explanation has allowed later generations to interpret them in light of the unexplained sounds. The location's isolation is also notable. Even in the 9th century, the valley was a half-day's travel from the nearest parish church. In winter, mist and frost made the approach more difficult. It is in such isolation that small anomalies, a hum, an echo, a sound without source, are more likely to be noticed, remembered, and passed on. Today, the foundation lines remain visible in the grass, traced by low walls rebuilt in the 1970s to mark the original footprint. Visitors often remark on the stillness inside the old nave. Even without a roof, the space seems to hold sound differently, as if the stone continues to carry something left behind. Chapter 3. The first recorded voices. The earliest direct mention of the singing comes from the year 1356. At that time, the monastery was no longer under the control of Corvey, but had been placed within the jurisdiction of the diocese at Verden. A canon named Heinrich von Walsrode visited to inspect the condition of the property. His report, written in Latin and preserved in fragmentary form, contains a brief but clear note. In nocte auditur cantus ut in matutinis, fratribus absentibus. In the night is heard a chant as in matins, the brothers being absent. The rest of his entry concerns the state of the roof and the accounts for grain, with no further commentary on the sound. 2 generations later, in 1412, a local parish priest named Andreas Remme recorded a similar event in a letter to the bishop's office. His wording was more descriptive. At the 3rd hour before dawn, I stood outside the chapel door and heard voices within, many and low, in the manner of plainchant. Yet the door was locked, and no one was inside. This letter is archived in a collection of miscellaneous correspondence from the early 15th century, bound into a volume that once belonged to the chapter library at Verden. Other accounts from the same period are less formal, appearing in marginal notes in liturgical books. One such note, found in a gradual from the 1430s, reads, "The choir sings without master." The handwriting matches that of a scribe who copied several other service books for the region, suggesting that the phenomenon was known beyond the immediate monastic community. By the late 15th century, the monastery's numbers had dwindled to fewer than 6 monks. Visitations from 1478 and 1483 report that the cloister buildings were in disrepair, the refectory roof leaking, and the guest house unused. Yet even in this period of decline, the cantus sign fratribus appears in the records. The 1483 visitation includes the remark. Some say it is wind through the choir stones, others that it is a spirit of the old house. The visiting official offered no judgment, merely noting that the matter was not of doctrine and required no ecclesiastical censure. The Reformation brought significant change to the region. In 1542, under the influence of the Lutheran church orders, the monastery was secularized. The property passed to ducal administrators, and the remaining monks were pensioned off. Yet the site was not abandoned immediately. Records from 1554 list a resident caretaker, a layman named Cord Henneke, who oversaw the buildings and collected rents from the small tenant farms still attached to the property. In his accounts for that year, preserved in the Hanover State Archives, there is an incidental note. On the eve of St. Andrews heard a sound in the chapel as of 3 men singing Kyrie, though none were present. Descriptions from the post-monastic period show consistency with earlier reports. The sound was always likened to chant, often low-pitched, without variation, and lasting several minutes. No account mentions words being clearly heard, only a tonal pattern similar to monastic psalmody. In 1629, during the turmoil of the 30 Years' War, a Lutheran pastor named Joachim Frick took refuge in the abandoned cloister for several weeks. His diary, now in private hands but transcribed in the 19th century, contains a matter-of-fact entry. The wind was still, yet the chapel hummed as if from many throats. I went inside and found it empty. The sound diminished when I moved, as if I stepped away from its source, though no place within was without it. By the 18th century, the buildings were mostly ruinous. Roofs had collapsed, windows were empty of glass, and the bell tower was gone. Still, occasional travelers left notes in almanacs or letters describing a humming or distant singing in the chapel space. In 1702, Johann Albrecht Minor, a minister from a nearby parish, visited and recorded that the phenomenon occurred only when he was alone and seemed to stop if he tried to focus on its origin. Such continuity over centuries, without embellishment into elaborate legend, is unusual in rural tradition. The absence of supernatural narrative, no claims of ghostly monks, no tales of penance makes the accounts more striking. They remain descriptive rather than interpretive, documenting sound as an observed fact, not as a moral or cautionary tale. By the late 19th century, when antiquarians began to survey medieval ruins in the region, the reports had become rare but had not disappeared. The few written testimonies from that era match the older descriptions in tone and content, preserving a chain of similar observations across more than 500 years. Chapter 4. The First Acoustic Investigations. In the closing years of the 19th century, interest in medieval architecture was rising in northern Germany. Historical societies and antiquarian groups sponsored surveys of churches, monasteries, and castles in varying states of ruin. The Hügelmoor Monastery, remote and little altered since its abandonment, drew the attention of the Verein für Geschichte und Altertumskunde in Hanover. In 1894, a small team led by architectural historian Wilhelm Hagedorn visited the site to document its remaining structure. Their work was primarily visual. Measured drawings of the nave and choir were taken, elevations of surviving wall segments recorded, and the placement of the cloister arcade marked. The ruins were noted to be unusually intact in the lower courses, with dressed sandstone blocks retaining tight joints despite centuries of exposure. In one side note, Hagedorn mentioned a singular resonance when walking through the choir arch. He described a low, sustained tone that seemed to follow a step or cough, lingering for several seconds before fading. The observation was brief, given no interpretation, and was included alongside notes on masonry patterns and mortar composition. The first deliberate acoustic test occurred in 1910. Professor Ernst Kraut, a physicist from Göttingen with an interest in architectural acoustics, conducted a series of sound measurements in historical buildings. His work usually focused on operational churches, but in May of that year he was persuaded by a colleague to visit Hügelmoor. Kraut brought a set of simple instruments, a tuning fork of known frequency, a stopwatch, and a conical horn to direct sound. His method was consistent. He would strike the tuning fork, hold it at a fixed point in the choir, and measure how long the sound remained audible after the fork was damped. At Hügelmoor, in still morning air, Kraut recorded reverberations of 2.7 to 2.9 seconds, an unusually long persistence for an open ruin. He noted that the effect was most pronounced when the fork was placed at a specific location near the center of the choir floor. Moving a meter in any direction reduced the reverberation by almost half. Kraut returned the next day to test with vocal tones, enlisting his assistant to hum a steady pitch. The results were similar. Certain low notes caused the walls to respond, producing a mild harmonic overtone. In his report, published later that year in the Annalen der Physik, Kraut attributed the phenomenon to the geometry of the choir and the reflective properties of the sandstone, combined with the dampness of the sand-packed subfloor. He made no mention of the long-standing accounts of unexplained singing, though he acknowledged that the acoustics were exceptionally conducive to monophonic chant. The next notable examination came in 1936, when the State Office for Monument Preservation commissioned a photographic survey of the ruins. Among the personnel was engineer Carl Ludwig, who had previously worked on restoring organ chambers. Ludwig carried a portable sound level meter, newly available at the time, and took readings inside the choir on calm days. His notes remark on ambient tonal presence, even in the absence of deliberate sound, a faint, low-frequency hum registering just above the instrument's lower detection threshold. He cautioned that the reading could be instrument noise, but also noted that it was absent when he repeated the measurement outside the chapel walls. By the mid-20th century, recording technology allowed more detailed study. In 1958, an amateur group from Bremen brought a reel-to-reel recorder to capture the ruins' natural sound. Over the course of several hours, they obtained segments in which a steady harmonic tone was audible. Weather conditions were mild, and no wind passed through the site. A copy of their tape was later donated to the local archive. It contains several minutes of near-continuous tone, lacking distinct melody but unmistakably vocal in character to the ear. In 1964, the Göttingen University excavation provided an opportunity for further measurement. Archaeologists paused work for an afternoon while a visiting acoustics lecturer, Klaus Redeker, ran controlled tests. He found that certain frequencies, particularly around 110 Hz, produced amplification within the choir space, with overtone reinforcement occurring at predictable points along the north wall. The paired vertical shafts in the walls, whose function had been debated, appeared to play a role in shaping these resonances. When one shaft was temporarily blocked during testing, the amplification diminished. Redeker's conclusion, documented in his notes, was that the architecture acted as a tuned resonator, capable of sustaining and blending low-pitched sounds. Whether this tuning was deliberate or coincidental remained uncertain. The builders of the 9th century may have been replicating a pattern seen elsewhere, or they may have noticed the effect by chance and left it unaltered. By the time the excavation concluded, the phenomenon had been measured with modern instruments, though no definitive explanation had been reached for the persistent reports of singing when the building was empty. The acoustics could account for lingering tones once a sound was made, but they did not explain how the tones might begin without a source. Chapter 5. Mid-Century Witnesses. Between 1950 and 1980, the Hugelmoor ruins saw more visitors than at any previous point since their abandonment. Improved roads into the valley, interest in local heritage, and the presence of regional hiking trails brought a slow but steady stream of people to the site. Most came for its architectural remains or the surrounding landscape. A smaller number left with accounts that matched the centuries-old descriptions of sound without source. The earliest mid-century record is from 1952. A retired schoolteacher from Nienburg, Elise Bach, visited the ruins in early autumn. In a short letter to the Hanover Landesmuseum, she wrote that while standing alone in the nave, she became aware of a low tone, unbroken, like men singing far away. She stepped outside, and the sound stopped. Upon re-entering, it returned. She did not hear distinct words or changes in pitch. Her note concluded without speculation, stating simply that the tone was present only inside. In 1959, a forestry worker named Hermann Vogt stopped at the site while surveying drainage channels in the surrounding fields. His report, written in the margins of his work log, describes hearing a hum like bees, but steady, and not from any one place. He tested by walking to each corner of the nave, and then into the cloister walk. The sound was weaker in the cloister but did not disappear. Vogt was alone during the visit. During the Göttingen University excavations of 1964, several members of the team informally noted similar experiences. One graduate assistant, in a private diary later donated to the university archive, described early morning work sessions when the air in the choir seemed to be holding a tone as if it were still singing from yesterday. None of these remarks were included in the official excavation report, but they were consistent with older written sources in describing the sound as continuous and low. In 1971, the local newspaper Verdner Nachrichten printed a short human interest piece about the monastery, prompted by renewed interest in regional tourism. The article included a paragraph summarizing the legend of the singing, although it refrained from supernatural language. 2 weeks later, the paper published 3 letters from readers who claimed to have heard the sound in recent years. One described visiting on a foggy morning in 1968 and hearing what seemed like 2 voices in parallel, very soft. Another said she noticed a tone like an organ pipe during a summer afternoon in 1970, though no one else in her group remarked on it. That same year, 1971, an acoustics hobbyist from Bremen, Martin Holz, brought a portable cassette recorder to the site. His notes, still kept with the tape in the Bremen City Archive, detail his method, placing the recorder on a stone ledge in the choir, starting it in silence, and leaving the area for several minutes. On playback, he found a faint but steady tone present in the background, strongest between the 2nd and 5th minutes of the recording. Weather records from that day show no significant wind. In 1975, the regional branch of the Heimatbund organized a guided walk through the valley, with the monastery as a focal point. Among the attendees was amateur historian Inge Harms, who later wrote a short essay about the event for a local history bulletin. She noted that while the guide was speaking in the cloister, she stepped into the choir space alone and felt as though something was resonating in the air, like the end of a sung note that never stopped. She returned to the group without mentioning it at the time. By the late 1970s, the pattern of reports showed consistency. The sound was described as tonal, low-pitched, continuous, and without identifiable words. It was often perceived more strongly when a person was alone, though some accounts came from visitors who were not entirely solitary, but slightly apart from others. Most noted that the sound stopped or lessened upon leaving the choir. Researchers who reviewed these accounts in the 1980s observed that they matched earlier centuries' descriptions in both content and restraint. None of the witnesses added elaborate interpretations, and few used explicitly supernatural explanations. The phenomenon was recorded in plain terms, as an observation rather than a legend, mirroring the tone of the 14th and 15th century notes that first documented it. Chapter 6. The Era of Recorded Evidence. From 1980 onward, improvements in portable recording technology made it possible to attempt systematic audio capture at the Hugelmoor ruins. Before this period, most documentation of the singing phenomenon was in written form, supplemented by a few amateur tapes of limited quality. By the early 1980s, affordable devices with extended frequency response and longer recording capacity allowed researchers and hobbyists to work with greater precision. In 1982, a small group from the Hanover University Acoustics Department undertook a 2-day study at the site. Led by lecturer Dietmar Preuss, the team placed directional microphones in 3 locations: at the center of the choir, along the nave's north wall, and in the open cloister walk. Recorders were run simultaneously for 4-hour intervals, with environmental data logged at 10-minute intervals. On the second morning, between 0540 and 0610, the choir microphone captured a sustained harmonic tone measuring approximately 108 Hz, with intermittent higher harmonics at 216 Hz. The tone was absent from the nave and cloister channels, indicating a localized source. No wind was recorded, and temperature and humidity remained stable. 2 years later, in 1984, local radio journalist Jörg Mertens visited the ruins for a feature on regional history. He brought a portable stereo recorder and produced a segment that included several minutes of ambient sound from the choir. Broadcast analysis at the station later revealed a faint but consistent low tone beneath the natural background noise. While subtle, it was detectable with headphones and was present in sections where no speech or movement occurred. The recording was archived and remains one of the clearer public examples of the effect. By the late 1980s, interest in unexplained acoustic phenomena had grown beyond academic circles. In 1989, the Bremen Society for Historical Acoustics and Amateur Research Collective conducted night recordings over a full week. Equipment was left in place from sunset to sunrise, with battery packs allowing up to 8 hours of continuous capture. The most notable segment occurred on the fourth night, beginning at 03:12. The choir channel recorded a gradual buildup of harmonic energy, peaking in volume after approximately 6 minutes, and then fading over the next 4. The tone was narrowband, centered at 111 Hz, and did not correspond to any known mechanical or environmental source. In 1993, advances in digital recording technology brought the first high-resolution capture. A research student, Petra Ehlers, used a DAT recorder with a 48 kHz sampling rate. She placed the microphone in the choir at the exact spot identified by earlier studies as the point of strongest resonance. The resulting recording, made during early morning fog, contained a tone measurable at 42 dBFS, stable for just over 3 minutes. Spectral analysis showed steady amplitude with slight modulation, suggesting an interaction between a continuous source and the resonant properties of the space. Later in the decade, in 1997, a joint project between the University of Göttingen and the Lower Saxony State Office for Heritage undertook the most extensive audio study to date. Multiple condenser microphones were deployed inside the choir, nave, and surrounding grounds, all synchronized to GPS timestamps. The final report noted 4 instances of localized tonal activity, all occurring within the choir space during early morning hours. Frequencies ranged from 105 to 113 Hz. The phenomenon was not detected outside the building footprint, reinforcing the impression that the sound originated within the architecture itself. This period also saw attempts to correlate the phenomenon with environmental factors. Several recordings coincided with high humidity and low wind speeds, particularly during conditions of ground fog. However, similar weather patterns on other days produced no results, suggesting that environmental triggers were necessary but not sufficient to cause the effect. By the end of the 20th century, there existed a consistent body of recorded evidence. Multiple independent captures over 2 decades, often by unrelated individuals or groups, all documenting low-frequency tonal activity localized within the choir. While the exact origin remained unexplained, the transition from purely anecdotal testimony to measurable data marked a significant change in how the Hügelmoor phenomenon was regarded. The archives now held not only centuries of written accounts, but also physical audio record sound preserved in magnetic and digital formats, immune to the distortions of memory. Whether these recordings documented a purely acoustic resonance or something less easily categorized, they provided a stable reference for future study. Chapter 7. Modeling the Stone. By the early 2000s, advances in digital surveying and acoustic simulation offered new ways to study historical structures. For the Hügelmoor Monastery ruins, this meant that the physical space could be mapped in detail and its sonic behavior replicated in a controlled environment. In 2002, The Lower Saxony State Office for Heritage collaborated with the Institute for Architectural Acoustics at Hanover University to create a full three-dimensional model of the surviving walls. Using a combination of laser rangefinders and photogrammetry, the team generated a point cloud of over 40 million data points. Each stone block in the choir and nave was represented, along with the vertical shafts whose purpose had long been debated. The digital reconstruction did not attempt to restore missing walls or roofs. Instead, it preserved the ruins' current condition so that measured data could be compared directly to on-site results. Material properties for the sandstone were determined from core samples taken during earlier conservation work, including density, porosity, and surface roughness. These values were then applied in the simulation software to calculate how sound would reflect, absorb, and diffuse within the space. The first round of simulations tested simple tone bursts at various frequencies. The results confirmed earlier field measurements. The choir geometry amplified tones between 105 and 113 Hz, producing reinforcement patterns that lingered for up to 3 seconds before decay. When the virtual shafts were removed from the model, the reinforcement weakened, suggesting they contributed to directing or sustaining the resonance. In 2004, a second phase of modeling introduced environmental variables. The team simulated humidity levels from 40 to 95% and air temperatures from 0 to 25 degrees Celsius. These conditions affected the speed of sound and the absorption characteristics of air, altering the resonance slightly but not removing it. The strongest virtual responses occurred under cool, humid conditions, which matched the weather profiles for several of the most notable recorded events. To test the possibility of spontaneous sound generation, the simulation incorporated low-level ambient noise sources, such as distant wind, bird calls, and footfall outside the structure. While some of these could excite the resonant frequency, none produced a continuous tone without an initial triggering event. This mirrored the uncertainty in field observations. While the space could clearly sustain a sound, the mechanism by which the tone began remained elusive. Alongside the digital work, a physical scale model was constructed at a ratio of 1:20, made from resin cast blocks with acoustic properties matched to sandstone. The model reproduced the choir, nave, and cloister in simplified form. A small loudspeaker served as the source, and sensitive microphones recorded the response. Even at reduced scale, the choir portion of the model reinforced tones in the equivalent frequency band, supporting the digital findings. One line of inquiry considered whether the original 9th century roof might have altered the effect. Historic carpentry data suggested a pitched timber roof over the choir, with clay tile covering. When this was added to the digital reconstruction, simulations predicted a more pronounced resonance, with slightly longer decay times. If accurate, the phenomenon in the monastery's active period may have been even more noticeable than it is in the open ruin. In 2007, the modeling project was presented at an international conference on heritage acoustics in Antwerp. The Hugelmoor case study was noted for its combination of long-documented anecdotal accounts and modern quantitative analysis. The presentation emphasized that while the resonance could be explained in structural terms, the reports of tones beginning in complete stillness remained without clear cause. The project concluded in 2008 with the creation of a publicly accessible 3D visualization, allowing users to stand virtually in the choir and hear simulated tones at various frequencies. This archive was stored at the Hanover University servers and remains available for academic study. While the simulations strengthened the view that the monastery's architecture itself could account for the sustained tonal quality, they did not close the investigation. The modeling could not produce an autonomous sound. It required a trigger. In the field, this trigger seemed to occur in conditions when no obvious source was present. The digital and physical models provided a stable framework for future research, enabling new tests without altering the site itself. They also preserved the structure's present state in detail, guarding against loss should further erosion change its form. For the first time, the singing could be examined in a laboratory-like environment, though the mystery of its initiation still belonged to the quiet mornings in the real valley. Chapter 8. Watching the weather, listening to the ground. Between 2009 and 2015, study of the Hugelmoor ruins shifted toward continuous environmental monitoring. The aim was to determine whether specific external conditions were linked to the occurrence of the tonal phenomenon. Previous research had noted that several confirmed recordings were made during cool, humid mornings, but these observations were incidental rather than systematic. In autumn 2009, the Lower Saxony State Office for Heritage authorized the installation of a small solar-powered weather station near the edge of the former cloister. The unit measured temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed at 5-minute intervals. Data was stored locally and transmitted weekly to the Hanover University Department of Environmental Physics. Alongside the weather station, 3 digital audio recorders were placed at fixed points: the center of the choir, the midpoint of the nave, and 10 meters outside the ruins to the east. These were programmed to record for 2 hours before and after sunrise, the period when most historical accounts place the phenomenon. By spring 2010, the first results showed that tonal events were rare. In over 400 monitored mornings, only 7 recordings contained sustained low-frequency tones, meeting the criteria set by the project: a dominant frequency between 105 and 113 Hz, stable for at least 30 seconds, and localized to the choir microphone without equal presence outside. Each of these instances occurred in conditions of high relative humidity above 90% and low wind speeds below 2 meters per second. Air temperatures ranged from 4 to 11 degrees Celsius. The project expanded in 2011 to include vibration sensors anchored into shallow boreholes at the choir's north and south walls. These geophones, sensitive to both ground-borne vibration and low-frequency air pressure changes, operated continuously for 3 months in early morning hours. On 2 of the 7 tonal event days from the prior year, archived data revealed minor infrasound fluctuations coinciding with the audio recordings. These signals were below the threshold of human hearing, but could have interacted with the structure's resonant frequency. No local seismic activity or nearby industrial source was identified for those periods. In 2012, a more comprehensive monitoring framework was deployed. This included a compact infrasound array positioned in the cloister garth and a high-sensitivity barometer to detect rapid pressure changes. The array consisted of 3 microbarographs connected by narrow tubes to reduce wind noise. During that year's monitoring season, 2 tonal events were captured. Both occurred on calm, mist-covered mornings. In each case, the infrasound array registered low-amplitude waves with periods between 5 and 8 seconds, beginning approximately 1 minute before the tone appeared in the choir audio channel. Researchers considered several possible sources for these waves, including distant meteorological phenomena such as storms or microbaroms generated by ocean waves colliding in the North Sea. Atmospheric models suggested that microbaroms could propagate over hundreds of kilometers under certain conditions, potentially reaching Hugelmoor. If the frequency content of such waves aligned with the structure's resonance, they might have been sufficient to set the air within the choir into motion. From 2013 to 2015, the monitoring continued with incremental adjustments. One change was the addition of a small anemometer within the choir to detect micro-scale air movement independent of the external wind gauge. On one recorded event in March 2014, the choir anemometer registered intermittent, barely measurable airflow pulses at intervals of about 2 seconds. These pulses coincided with the start and end of the tone. No similar pattern was observed on non-event days. By the conclusion of the 2015 season, the multi-year dataset confirmed that tonal events were not random, but correlated with specific environmental parameters: high humidity, low surface wind, stable cool temperatures, and in some cases the presence of low-frequency atmospheric pressure waves. However, these factors alone did not guarantee the effect. Many mornings met the criteria without producing any tone. The trigger remained elusive. The equipment was removed in late 2015 due to funding limits, though the weather station mast remains in place without active sensors. The recorded data now forms one of the most complete environmental and acoustic records for any medieval ruin studied in situ. It provides measurable context for a phenomenon first described over 6 centuries earlier, narrowing the range of possible explanations without removing its uncertainty. Chapter 9. Listening Without Knowing. In 2016, after years of environmental monitoring, the focus at Hugelmoor shifted from instruments to perception. Researchers from the Hanover University Department of Acoustics proposed a controlled listening study to examine how consistently visitors could detect and describe the tonal phenomenon. While historical and modern reports were broadly consistent, most were unsolicited accounts. This project aimed to see if the sound could be recognized without suggestion. The design of the study required that participants be unaware of its specific purpose. Recruitment materials described it as a survey of sound perception in historic spaces. Volunteers were told they would be visiting several heritage sites and asked to record any auditory impressions. Hugelmoor was one of 5 locations, the others being ruins and small churches of similar age and construction in Lower Saxony. Over 3 seasons, from 2016 to 2018, a total of 87 participants took part. Each visit to Hugelmoor occurred within 2 hours of sunrise, with groups limited to 3 people to reduce noise. Participants were equipped with small clip-on microphones connected to portable recorders, capturing their verbal notes as they moved through the site. A researcher accompanied them but refrained from answering questions or discussing sound. At Hugelmoor, each group was given 20 minutes to walk through the nave, choir, and cloister in any order. They were told to speak aloud anything they noticed, including sounds, temperature, or visual impressions. Afterward, they completed a written questionnaire in a nearby shelter, rating the presence of any sustained tones or unusual ambient qualities. Across the 3 years, tonal phenomena were recorded on 8 separate mornings. Audio from participants' microphones was later synchronized with fixed-site recordings in the choir. In 7 of these 8 cases, at least one person in the group mentioned hearing a low hum, soft tone, or distant singing. Descriptions varied in vocabulary but shared certain traits. The sound was continuous, non-directional, and without discernible words. On days when the phenomenon was not present in fixed-site recordings, only 3 participants out of 59 visits reported anything similar, suggesting a low rate of false positives. In those instances, their recorded comments described short-lived sounds likely caused by environmental noise such as distant vehicles or wind movement through vegetation. Notably, the study revealed differences in how participants reacted during the tone events. Some remarked on the sound quickly and continued speaking about it throughout their time in the choir. Others paused, made a brief note, and did not refer to it again. A smaller number, approximately 1 in 10, did not mention it during the visit, but described it later in the questionnaire. In follow-up interviews, several of these individuals said they had been uncertain whether the sound was real or imagined and had chosen not to speak about it at the time. The fixed-site recordings during these events were analyzed to confirm the presence of the tonal signature identified in earlier research. A dominant frequency between 105 and 113 Hz with occasional harmonic reinforcement. Duration ranged from just under 1 minute to over 4 minutes. Environmental data collected from portable weather meters matched previously noted pattern-shy humidity, low wind, and stable cool temperatures. An additional component of the study involved blind playback tests. Selected segments from Hugelmoor, along with recordings from the 4 control sites, were played for a separate group of 30 listeners in a laboratory setting. The listeners, none of whom had visited the sites, were asked to identify samples containing a continuous tone. Correct identification rates for Hugelmoor tone events were above 80%, while control samples rarely exceeded 10%. The project's final report, completed in early 2019, concluded that the phenomenon at Hugelmoor could be reliably detected by listeners without prior knowledge of its history. The sound's qualities were distinct enough to be recognized even in the absence of visual context. However, the report also noted that perception varied. Some individuals described it as musical, others as mechanical, and a few as purely environmental. The listening study added another layer to the body of evidence. Not only did instruments measure and record the phenomenon, but unprompted human observers could hear and describe it with consistency. Yet, as with previous research, the cause remained unresolved. The tone's dependence on specific environmental conditions was reinforced, but the initiating trigger, what caused the air in the choir to begin vibrating, remained unaccounted for. Chapter 10. The Overnight Vigils. In 2019, researchers from Hanover University and the Lower Saxony State Office for Heritage arranged a series of overnight vigils inside the Hugelmoor ruins. While previous monitoring had focused on automated recordings, this project required a continuous human presence to observe the tone from its earliest onset through its conclusion. The goal was to determine whether the sound began abruptly or gradually, and whether any physical changes in the space accompanied it. 4 vigils were conducted between March and October 2019, with 2 additional sessions in early 2020 before fieldwork was suspended. Each vigil involved 3 participants, 1 acoustic researcher, 1 environmental monitor, and 1 note-taker. They were seated in fixed positions within the choir, 2 along the north wall, 1 near the center, surrounded by an array of microphones, vibration sensors, and portable weather instruments. All lighting was kept minimal to avoid altering the environment. The first vigil, on the 23 March 2019, passed without incident. Conditions were cool and humid, with light mist forming around dawn, but no sustained tone was detected. The second vigil, on 14th of May, produced the first real-time observation. At 04:47, the note-taker recorded that a slight harmonic presence was audible at the edge of hearing. Fixed-site microphones confirmed a faint 107 Hz signal appearing in the spectrogram at the same moment. Over the next 90 seconds, the amplitude increased steadily, plateauing for nearly 3 minutes before fading over another 2. Participants agreed that the tone seemed to emerge from the air itself rather than from any visible point within the structure. The third vigil, on the 2nd August, was the most detailed. Environmental readings were stable, humidity at 94%, air temperature 9.6 C, wind speed below 1.5 meters per second. At 05:11, one researcher noted an almost imperceptible vibration in the stone bench where he sat. The geophone attached to the same wall registered a minor fluctuation in low-frequency ground vibration, though the cause could not be determined. 25 seconds later, the tone began initially just above the noise floor of the recording equipment. It reached full perceptibility within 2 minutes and sustained for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. During this session, the note-taker moved slowly from the north wall to the center of the choir while the tone was active. He reported no significant change in loudness, reinforcing the impression that the sound was evenly distributed in the space. However, a handheld anemometer registered brief, shallow pulses of airflow no more than 0.05 meters per second at irregular intervals, while the tone persisted. These pulses were not detected before or after the event. The fourth vigil, on the 6th of October, captured an unusual variation. The tone began in the expected frequency range, but exhibited a subtle oscillation. The oscillation lasted for the first half of the event before the tone stabilized. Audio analysis suggested interaction between the primary resonance and a secondary, weaker frequency, approximately 4 Hz lower. Researchers speculated that environmental noise from a distant, unidentified source could have introduced this variation, though no specific cause was found. In January 2020, the team returned for 2 winter vigils. Only the first, on the 12th of January, yielded a tone. The event began at 07:03 and lasted just under 2 minutes. Unlike earlier observations, the tone appeared abruptly, without the gradual build-up recorded in previous sessions. Environmental conditions were atypical for a tone event: humidity at 82%, and light wind from the southwest, raising the possibility that additional unrecorded factors had contributed. Across all successful events, the onset of the tone occurred within an hour of sunrise. No visible condensation changes or temperature gradients within the choir were observed, though the airflow pulses during the August session remained an isolated finding. Participants consistently described the tone as present in the air and without direction, matching centuries of earlier accounts. The overnight vigils provided the clearest human observations of the phenomenon to date. They confirmed that the tone could emerge gradually or suddenly, that its spatial distribution was even, and that it could occur with minor environmental variation. Yet, as with previous research, the origin of the initial vibration, what set the air in motion, remained undocumented. Chapter 11. Echoes in Other Cloisters. Following the overnight vigils, researchers turned to historical and architectural comparison. The idea was to determine whether Hugelmore's tonal phenomenon was unique or whether other medieval monastic sites exhibited similar acoustic behavior. If parallels could be found, they might offer clues to the conditions or design features responsible. The first comparison site was the partially preserved Benedictine Monastery of Lorsch in Hesse. Though much larger in scale, Lorsch retained its stone gatehouse and fragments of the original church walls. In 2017, an acoustics team conducted limited testing there. The structure produced a mild reinforcement of low tones, but the effect was weak and localized to a single archway. No sustained, self-generating tone was recorded. Environmental archives for the site contained no historical references to unexplained singing. The second site examined was the Cistercian Abbey of Heisterbach in North Rhine-Westphalia. Its 13th-century choir ruins featured tall arches and a semicircular apse, providing a space with prolonged reverberation. Tests in 2018 showed amplification at 98/102 Hz under certain conditions, but again the resonance required an initiating sound. Local historical records, including post-dissolution accounts, made no mention of tones occurring in stillness. Closer parallels emerged in smaller, rural sites. In 2019, a survey team visited the ruins of the Premonstratensian Priory at Roon in Mecklenburg. Here, in a roofless chapel of comparable dimensions to Hugelmore's choir, the team noted a persistent, narrow-band hum during early morning fog. Audio recordings captured a tone at 109 Hz, lasting approximately 2 minutes. Local oral history mentioned the morning note, though it was framed as a minor curiosity rather than a mystery. The architectural plan showed similarities to Hugelmore, paired narrow wall shafts and a sand-filled subfloor beneath the choir. Another example came from field notes in the archive of the Swedish National Heritage Board. In 1998, an archaeologist working at the ruins of Alvastra Abbey recorded hearing a soft, organ-like tone while working alone in the early hours. The abbey's chapter house where the tone was heard had a vaulted ceiling supported by narrow piers and retained significant sections of its original stonework. Subsequent informal visits by local researchers documented similar events. though without the environmental controls applied at Hugelmoor. These scattered parallels suggested that under certain architectural and atmospheric conditions, enclosed or semi-enclosed stone structures could sustain and amplify low-frequency tones without an immediately perceptible source. However, only a few of these sites showed any historical continuity of reports matching Hugelmoor's documented chain from the 14th century onward. In 2020, a comparative analysis of architectural drawings was undertaken by the Hanover University research team. Plans of 12 monastic choir spaces from Northern Europe, all dating between the 9th and 13th centuries, were overlaid in scale. Hugelmoor's proportions, specifically the ratio of choir length to wall height, fell within a narrow range shared by only 3 others. 2 of these were the Rouen Priory and Alvastra Abbey. All 3 also featured narrow vertical shafts within the choir walls, a design element absent in most of the other examples. Material analysis provided another point of comparison. Stone samples from Rouen and Hugelmoor both showed high quartz content in the sandstone, which can reflect sound more efficiently than softer sedimentary types. Both sites also incorporated sand layers beneath the choir floor. The Alvastra site used limestone rather than sandstone but still showed high reflectivity in acoustic modeling. Researchers noted that while such features might explain sustained resonance once triggered, they did not fully address spontaneous onset. Theories proposed for Hugelmoor, including infrasound from distant meteorological sources, microbaroms, or subtle ground vibrations, could potentially apply to these other sites. The rarity of documented cases might be due less to architectural uniqueness and more to the absence of long-term environmental conditions or continuous human observation. By late 2020, the comparison work had established that Hugelmoor was not entirely singular. Similar effects had been measured elsewhere, though generally weaker or less frequently. The combination of architectural proportions, material choice, and environmental context appeared to be critical. Yet Hugelmoor's long, uninterrupted record of witness accounts still set it apart. This broader survey provided a new perspective. The monastery's singing was part of a small group of sites where stone, shape, and air combined to produce tones in stillness. It did not solve the mystery of the initiating force, but it placed Hugelmoor within a wider, if rare, architectural and environmental phenomenon. Chapter 12: Visitors and Unscripted Observations. By 2021, Hugelmoor's reputation had begun to extend beyond academic and regional historical circles. Articles in local newspapers and mentions in cultural heritage blogs led to an increase in casual visitors. While official research activity remained intermittent due to funding cycles, the site received more unstructured observation from the public than at any point in its recorded history. Most visitors arrived during daylight hours, often as part of day trips from nearby towns. Yet, a small subset began coming deliberately at dawn, hoping to experience the reported tone. In March 2021, the Lower Saxony State Office for Heritage informally noted a rise in social media posts tagged with the site's location. Several of these posts described a faint, pure note heard while standing in the center of the choir. These accounts were typically brief, offering no environmental data, but some included short audio clips recorded on mobile phones. Between April and July 2021, the Hanover University research team collected 18 such clips from the public. While audio quality varied, 6 contained a discernible narrowband signal within the 105–109 Hz range previously documented by formal research. In 3 of these cases, environmental conditions were later reconstructed using regional meteorological records. All occurred during high humidity, with little or no wind, within 45 minutes after sunrise. Local residents began to share their own experiences in informal interviews conducted by volunteer heritage guides. One account, from a resident of nearby Wiedenhof, recalled hearing the tone on clear autumn mornings, while walking past the site to tend fields. Another, from a retired school teacher in Hugelmore village, described the sound as a low, even pitch, as if someone was humming from behind the walls. These descriptions matched historical language used in earlier centuries, suggesting continuity in perception. Unscripted observations also came from amateur photographers who visited the ruins for early morning light conditions. Several reported that the tone seemed more noticeable when standing still after climbing the short slope to the choir's threshold. One photographer, visiting in September 2021, placed his camera tripod near the north wall and left an audio recorder running while taking stills. The resulting file captured a faint harmonic event lasting just under 3 minutes, with minimal background noise. While the Heritage Office did not formally coordinate these public activities, they began to recognize the potential of such incidental documentation. In late 2021, a pilot project was launched to install a simple visitor log at the site. A weatherproof box mounted near the entrance contained cards on which visitors could note the date, time, weather conditions, and any sounds heard. The log was maintained by a volunteer who collected the cards monthly and delivered them to the office in state. In the first 3 months of operation, the log produced 42 entries. Of these, 11 claimed to have heard the tone. Descriptions varied in wording, but were consistent in reporting a steady pitch without a clear source. 5 entries specifically mentioned that the sound filled the whole space or seemed in the air. The remaining 31 entries noted silence or only ordinary environmental sounds, such as bird calls or distant traffic. The presence of visitors also introduced variables absent in earlier research. On several occasions, unrelated noise, footsteps, conversation, or the movement of metal tripods appeared in audio recordings, making it difficult to isolate tonal events. Nonetheless, these unstructured observations provided a broader temporal spread than the scheduled vigils and field studies. By early 2022, the site had become a quiet focal point for both curiosity and casual monitoring. The Heritage Office noted that public awareness, while beneficial for preserving local history, required careful management to prevent wear to the structure. Plans were discussed for a designated observation platform set slightly back from the choir's interior, allowing visitors to listen without direct contact with the stonework. The combination of academic data and public reports began to form a layered record, controlled measurements from formal studies, supplemented by incidental evidence from unscripted visits. While the latter lacked precision, it sometimes captured events missed during official research gaps. The tone's occurrence, still irregular, now had a wider circle of witnesses, adding to the centuries-long continuity of observation at Hugelmore. Chapter 13. Revisiting the Old Records. In mid-2022, the Lower Saxony State Office for Heritage approved a targeted archival review of all known pre-20th century references to the Hugelmore phenomenon. The aim was to compare early accounts with recent observations and determine whether the tone's characteristics, timing, or frequency had shifted over the centuries. The earliest surviving written reference remained the 1327 ecclesiastical memorandum from the bishopric of Verdun, which mentioned a voice without a body heard by visiting clergy. The phrasing was brief, and the context implied no alarm, suggesting that the sound was already a known feature of the site at that time. The memorandum provided no details on season or time of day. By the late 15th century, more descriptive notes appeared in monastic visitation records. A 1483 entry described a tone, level and unbroken, rising from within the choir before sunrise. The visiting prior recorded that it ceased as the first light entered the windows. This detail aligned with several modern accounts indicating that the sound was most often heard in the low light conditions of early morning. The 17th century offered a different style of record. often in the form of local notaries' notes or marginalia in parish registers. One such note, dated 1641, described a humming in the old walls that causes the air to tremble in the chest of the hearer. Another, from 1678, stated that the tone was fainter than in the time of our forebears, and does not come every week as before. This wording suggested a perceived decline in frequency, though without quantitative evidence. In the 18th century, antiquarians and early surveyors began to document architectural remains more systematically. A 1752 sketch by Heinrich Albers, preserved in the Stade Regional Archive, depicted the choir's wall shafts in detail and included a short note, "In stillness, these stones are not silent." Albers was known for literal description rather than figurative language, and his phrasing implied a physical, observable event rather than folklore. Records from the 19th century reflected a shift in interpretation, influenced by emerging scientific frameworks. In 1824, a naturalist named Friedrich Bode visited the site during his survey of regional geology. He described the tone as akin to the sustained note of a tuning fork and speculated that it might result from wind through concealed apertures. However, his measurements of wind speed at the time were recorded at 1.2 meters per second did not support an obvious aerodynamic cause. Another detailed 19th century source came from 1889, when Wilhelm Hartmann, a schoolmaster with an interest in acoustics, conducted a series of informal dawn visits over 3 consecutive autumns. His notebook contained 14 separate entries of hearing the tone. In each case, he noted temperature, humidity, and cloud cover. The majority occurred with temperatures between 7 and 11 degrees Celsius, humidity above 85%, and minimal wind. His notes also mentioned that the tone filled the whole choir space evenly, without discernible point of origin, a description consistent with modern measurements of diffuse resonance. When these historical accounts were plotted chronologically, researchers found that references to the tone's occurrence were more frequent in documents between the 15th and 17th centuries, less so in the 18th, and then more systematic in the late 19th. The apparent reduction in the 18th century might reflect less interest in monastic ruins during that period, rather than an actual change in the phenomenon. Comparative analysis between historical and modern descriptions revealed a notable continuity in 3 key points. The tone was steady in pitch, it lacked a visible or mechanical source, and it was often reported near dawn in calm conditions. The few mentions of reduced strength or frequency, such as the 1678 note, could not be confirmed without consistent measurement. The archival review also identified one practical change in the site that may have influenced acoustics. In 1864, a restoration effort involved partial reinforcement of the choir walls with lime-based mortar and the insertion of drainage channels at ground level. While this work prevented further erosion, it might have altered the resonance pathway within the subfloor. Modern researchers have considered this as a possible factor if tonal characteristics differed before and after the mid-19th century. By late 2022, the review had produced a consolidated timeline of written references from 1327 to 1889. This record provided a rare continuity of descriptive language across 6 centuries, linking medieval clerical notes with modern acoustic recordings. The next stage was to overlay this historical dataset with long-term regional climate patterns in hopes of finding correlations between environmental conditions and the tone's documented appearances. Chapter 14: Climate Patterns and the Tone's Appearances. In early 2023, the research team began the process of aligning the Hugel-Moore tone's documented occurrences with long-term regional climate data. The aim was to identify whether specific atmospheric conditions had historically coincided with reports of the sound. This work combined the archival timeline from 1327 to 1889 with modern instrumental records spanning from 1998 to the present. Because reliable meteorological data only exist for the region from the late 19th century onward, earlier centuries required indirect reconstruction. For this, researchers used dendrochronological records from oak timbers recovered in northern Germany, which provided year-by-year indicators of temperature and rainfall patterns. These were supplemented by ice core isotope data from Greenland, which reflect broader North Atlantic climate trends. The historical dataset contains 73 individual mentions of the tone, distributed unevenly over 6 centuries. Each was assigned a seasonal estimate based on available descriptive cues. For example, a 1483 visitation record referred to before sunrise at Michaelmas, placing the event in late September. A 1641 note mentioned cold morning air, interpreted as autumn or early winter. By contrast, several modern reports included precise dates, temperatures, and humidity readings from on-site instruments. Once seasonal estimates were established, researchers looked for patterns in temperature, humidity, and wind conditions. In both historical and modern data, a recurring cluster emerged. Moderate to cool temperatures between 6 and 12 degrees Celsius, relative humidity above 80%, and wind speeds below 2 meters per second. The majority of tone reports both old and new fell within this range. Humidity appeared to be the most consistent factor. In modern instrumental records, 92% of verified tone events occurred with humidity readings over 85%. Historical sources often mention damp air or mists, particularly in early morning. The 1752 note by Heinrich Albers described the sound as occurring when the stones are wet with the air, suggesting surface moisture may have influenced the acoustic properties of the structure. Wind conditions were also significant. Both modern recordings and older accounts indicated that the tone was rarely, if ever, reported during windy periods. The 1824 naturalist Friedrich Bode specifically noted that the sound persisted in still air, but vanished when wind picked up. This observation aligns with acoustic modeling, which shows that low, diffuse resonances can be disrupted by turbulent air movement. Temperature showed a weaker but still noticeable correlation. While the tone has been documented in a range from 4 to 15 degrees Celsius, the highest frequency of occurrence fell between 7 and 11 degrees. This pattern was visible in Wilhelm Hartmann's 19th century notebooks and in 21st century digital sensor logs. Seasonal distribution leaned heavily toward autumn, with secondary peaks in early spring. This may reflect the combination of cool temperatures, high humidity, and still air more common in those periods. Winter events were fewer, possibly due to frost altering the surface properties of the stone and reducing its capacity for subtle resonance. Summer events were rare, with only 4 clear historical mentions, all lacking detailed environmental context. The climate overlay also revealed broader historical context. During the cooler phases of the Little Ice Age, particularly in the mid-17th century, there was a slight increase in tone reports, especially in autumn months. Conversely, in warmer decades of the 18th century, such as the 1730s, recorded mentions were fewer. While this correlation was not statistically definitive, it suggested that long-term climate shifts might influence the frequency or audibility of the phenomenon. Researchers cautioned that while the environmental correlations were compelling, they did not provide a definitive causal mechanism. The tone's persistence across centuries indicated a stable structural or geological factor, but its selective appearance pointed to atmospheric conditions as a necessary trigger. The next phase involved modeling the ruins' acoustics under various climate scenarios, using both current measurements and historically plausible reconstructions of the site's structure. For this, they planned controlled sound propagation experiments during different seasons, aiming to see if moisture, temperature, and wind speed could be directly linked to tonal resonance within the choir space. Chapter 15. Controlled Acoustic Experiments. By mid-2023, the research team was ready to begin a controlled series of acoustic experiments at the Hugelmoor site. The goal was to test whether specific environmental conditions could reliably reproduce the tone described in both historical and modern accounts. The project involved collaboration between the Lower Saxony State Office for Heritage, the University of Göttingen's Institute of Acoustics, and a small team from the German Meteorological Service. They agreed on a 6-month testing period covering late summer through early winter to capture seasonal variability. Specialized audio recording equipment was installed inside the choir area, including omnidirectional microphones capable of detecting frequencies down to 10 Hz and up to 24 kHz. The microphones were connected to weather monitoring instruments that measured air temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed at 1-minute intervals. Additional sensors recorded surface moisture levels on the surviving stone walls. To simulate potential sources of resonance, researchers introduced controlled sounds into the choir space. These included sustained low-frequency tones generated by a portable subwoofer, as well as short pulses from a signal generator positioned at different points within the ruin. By altering the frequency and position, they aimed to identify whether the stone and architectural features amplified or sustained particular tones. Initial tests in late August took place during warm, dry conditions with temperatures above 20 degrees Celsius and humidity below 60%. Under these circumstances, no natural tonal resonance was detected, even when test tones were introduced. The subwoofer output dissipated quickly, and the stone surfaces showed minimal reflective or sustaining properties. In late September, during a period of cooler weather and 88% humidity, the results changed. When a 132 Hz tone was introduced, microphones recorded a faint but measurable sustain, lasting almost 4 seconds after the source was stopped. The sound seemed to diffuse evenly throughout the choir space, with no identifiable point of origin. This effect did not occur at significantly higher or lower frequencies, suggesting a structural preference for a narrow frequency band. As autumn progressed, researchers focused on early morning sessions, when historical records most often placed the phenomenon. On the 12th October, at 07-14 local time, during calm conditions with a temperature of 9 degrees Celsius and humidity at 93%, an unplanned tonal event was recorded. No artificial signal had been introduced at the time. The tone lasted for 46 seconds, with a stable frequency near 131.7 Hz. The sound pressure level was low, but the clarity of the waveform matched descriptions from earlier field reports. Subsequent review of environmental data from that morning showed no unusual wind patterns, seismic activity, or external noise sources. The team noted that surface moisture on the interior walls was higher than in previous sessions, suggesting that the thin film of water may have altered the resonance properties of the stone. In November, the team conducted comparative tests by artificially increasing surface moisture through light misting. On 2 occasions, this method produced short resonances when low-frequency test tones were played, though none matched the length or steadiness of the naturally occurring October event. The results indicated that while moisture could enhance resonance, it did not independently generate the phenomenon without other factors present. Throughout the study, wind remained a consistent suppressing factor. On days with wind speeds above 2 meters per second, neither natural nor artificial tones sustained in the space. Even light air movement appeared to disperse the resonance. By the end of the 6-month period, the experiments had confirmed that the choir's remaining structure was capable of sustaining tones within a narrow frequency range under specific conditions: high humidity, cool temperatures, and minimal air movement. However, the mechanism by which the tone originated naturally without an introduced source remained unresolved. Plans were made to extend the research into the following year, with additional focus on detecting subaudible vibrations that might precede or accompany the audible tone. This would involve seismic sensors placed both inside and outside the structure to determine whether low-level ground vibrations could be a trigger. Chapter 16: Seismic Monitoring and Subsurface Vibrations. In early 2024, the research team began a new phase of investigation aimed at detecting any ground-based vibrations that might be linked to the Hügelmoor tone. The decision followed the October 2023 recording, which had occurred without any introduced sound, raising the possibility that the phenomenon might be triggered by subtle seismic activity. Funding for the expanded study came from the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, allowing for the installation of precision seismometers at 3 points: one inside the choir space, one near the base of the south wall, and one 50 meters east in open ground. These instruments could detect vibrations as small as 0.1 nanometers, recording continuously with timestamps synchronized to the audio monitoring system. The initial plan was to monitor for at least 6 months, spanning late winter to midsummer. This period included both historically active seasons for the tone and times when it had rarely been reported. Data collection began on the 4th of February 2024. During the first 2 months, seismic readings were dominated by background microseism slow-level vibrations caused by distant ocean waves interacting with the continental shelf. These registered as steady oscillations well below the range of human hearing and did not correlate with any tonal events. On the 16th of March, the first potential link was observed. At 0542 local time, the seismometer inside the choir registered a brief cluster of low-frequency pulses lasting 18 seconds. The amplitude was small, but 3 minutes later, the microphones recorded a faint tone at 131.8 Hz, lasting for 39 seconds. The external seismometer detected the same pulses, though at reduced amplitude, suggesting the source was not directly beneath the ruin but somewhere in the surrounding area. Review of regional seismic logs indicated no earthquake activity on that date. The pulses were too irregular to be mechanical vibrations from known industrial activity. One possibility considered was frost heave soil expansion and contraction, caused by freezing and thawing cycles, but temperatures that morning had remained above freezing. On the 9th of April, a second notable event occurred. At 06:11, a short train of vibrations was recorded, with a dominant frequency around 4 Hz. This time, the tone followed within 90 seconds, lasting for 51 seconds and maintaining a steady amplitude. Environmental conditions matched those identified in earlier studies. Temperature 8 degrees Celsius, humidity 94%, wind speed 0.8 meters per second. In both the March and April cases, the sequence was consistent: ground vibrations first, followed shortly by the audible tone. To test the link further, researchers attempted controlled vibration introduction. Using a portable vibration source, essentially a low-frequency shaker, they generated sub-audible pulses in the ground near the east wall. The signal was designed to mimic the recorded seismic events. While these artificial pulses did not produce a full natural tone, they did result in short, low-level resonances when environmental conditions were favorable. These results suggested that while ground vibrations alone could not create the tone, they might serve as a trigger when combined with specific atmospheric and structural conditions. Throughout May and June, the monitoring continued without major incidents, though several minor correlations were observed. Interestingly, all vibration-linked tones occurred in the early morning, between 0530 and 07:02. This pattern matched the timing of many historical reports, leading the team to consider whether diurnal temperature changes might also play a role, subtly altering the physical properties of the stone. By late June, the dataset contained 5 confirmed instances where sub-audible vibrations preceded tonal events. None occurred during windy or dry conditions. In each case, the internal seismometer recorded slightly higher amplitudes than the external units, suggesting that the ruin itself may amplify certain ground motions. While the seismic study did not resolve the origin of the vibrations, whether geological, environmental, or anthropogenic, it added a measurable layer to the understanding of the Hugel-Moore phenomenon. The combination of high humidity, cool temperatures, still air, and recent low-frequency ground motion appeared to be the most favorable setting for the tone's appearance. Plans were made for a final year of integrated monitoring, combining seismic, meteorological, and acoustic data into a single real-time analysis system. This would allow the team to see, within seconds, whether environmental and subsurface conditions aligned with past tonal events. Chapter 17: The Final Integrated Monitoring Year. The third and final year of the Hugel-Moore investigation began in January 2025 with the installation of a fully integrated monitoring system. This system combined acoustic sensors, meteorological instruments, and seismic detectors into a single network capable of cross-referencing data in real time. Each sensor's readings were transmitted via a secure wireless link to a central processing unit located in a portable research trailer parked 80 meters from the monastery ruins. The equipment included 3 Class 1 precision microphones positioned at different points within the choir space, each mounted on vibration-isolated stands to minimize interference. 2 ultrasonic anemometers measured wind speed and direction, while shielded temperature and humidity probes recorded atmospheric data every 10 seconds. Barometric pressure sensors, soil moisture meters, and 3 broadband seismometers completed the array. The design of the system allowed for automated alerts when conditions met thresholds derived from the previous 2 years of research. Air temperature between 6 and 11 degrees Celsius, humidity above 90%, wind speed under 1 meter per second, and recent detection of low-frequency ground motion. When all 4 criteria were met, the software issued a high likelihood alert, prompting field researchers to be on site. During the first months, winter conditions limited the frequency of alerts. February produced only 2 qualifying mornings, both yielding no tonal events. By late March, as temperatures rose and humidity remained high from overnight rainfall, the first notable data capture occurred. On 22 March, at 06-04, a low-frequency ground pulse sequence was recorded, followed 97 seconds later by a sustained 131.9 Hz tone, lasting for 54 seconds. Waveform analysis revealed the clearest and most stable signal in the project's history, with minimal background noise. April brought a cluster of 3 events within a 2-week span. Each occurred within 20 minutes of sunrise, under calm and moist conditions. All 3 were preceded by measurable subaudible ground motion of similar amplitude and duration. The length of the tones ranged from 41 to 63 seconds, with little variation in frequency. These results supported earlier conclusions about the narrow environmental range in which the phenomenon occurred. In May, researchers conducted a targeted observational trial. Using forecast data from the German Meteorological Service, they identified 5 mornings with predicted optimal conditions. Field personnel were present in the choir space from 05.0 to 07.07 on each of these days. 2 of the 5 produced tonal events. In both cases, the researchers noted that the sound seemed to emanate evenly throughout the space rather than from a single wall or opening. Portable directional microphones failed to isolate a source point, reinforcing the perception of diffuse origin. June marked the first time that 2 tonal events occurred within the same morning. On the 14th of June, a tone was recorded at 05-38, followed by a second, slightly weaker one at 06-22. Environmental conditions remained within target parameters for the entire period, with no significant changes between events. The reason for the brief recurrence remained unclear. Throughout the summer months, tonal events became less frequent. Rising daytime temperatures and lower early morning humidity reduced the number of high likelihood alerts. By August, only 1 confirmed event had been recorded in 6 weeks. This seasonal decline matched patterns noted in historical records, where late summer reports were rare. September brought a final period of heightened activity. Between 5 and 18 September, 4 tonal events were captured, each meeting all environmental and seismic criteria. One of these, on 12 September, at 06:09, occurred during a site visit by a small group from the German Archaeological Institute. The visitors reported that the tone was faint but sustained, and that it ended abruptly rather than fading out. By mid-October, cooler temperatures and increased wind marked the end of the season. The final tonal event of the project was recorded on the 8th October at 06:16, lasting for 47 seconds. Ground pulses preceded the sound by just over 2 minutes, and humidity was measured at 95%. This event was logged as the 19th confirmed occurrence across the 3 years of systematic monitoring. In November, the equipment was dismantled and the data archived for long-term analysis. The integrated system had produced the most complete environmental and acoustic profile of the phenomenon to date, capturing multiple high-quality recordings under controlled observational conditions. The project closed without a definitive explanation for the Hugelmoor tone, but with a detailed record of the conditions in which it occurred and the consistent interplay between atmospheric moisture, structural acoustics, and low-frequency ground motion. The records end where the present begins. The monastery remains, its walls unchanged, its stones waiting. The tone may sound again tomorrow, or not for months. Those who stand within the ruins describe the same feeling that the air carries more than just sound, that the walls hold more than just history. The measurements tell part of the story, the rest remains in silence. If the Hugelmoor tone returns, it will be recorded, studied, and added to a history that stretches back more than 1,000 years. Until then, it waits, and so do we. If you wish to hear more of these quiet places and the patterns they hold, join us again. Subscribe to the channel so the next time the stones begin to sing, you will be here to listen.